Tonight's talk is not quite a repetition of what you saw before. Some of you might, hopefully this looks a little bit familiar to you. And I'm doing this for a reason. So the first few slides will be a bit of repetition, but revised and updated slides with less information to hopefully make things a bit more simplistic. And then to give you hopefully two things. First of all, the further confirmation that there are so many ways we can look at the Word of God and really understand that this book cannot just be coincidentally put together by men or something that was fabricated by people as a piece of, what would you call it? Something that's not real, a scam or something like that. So we're going to look at this fascinating one day is 1,000 years for God principle in Bible prophecy. And we'll do a few things about, just mention a few things that would be helpful when we look at prophecy as well, obviously. So I'm going to now take my video away so you can just focus on the screen. They're seeing that my background is really only a white wall anyway. All right. So what are we talking about? This idea that a literal day can prophetically represent 1,000-year period. And later on in this talk, you're going to see an example from Hosea, which I kind of find fascinating because I don't know, I don't think the prophets themselves particularly might have known about this, or whether it is the Spirit leading them and they are saying things that just fit into all of this so well. So we'll get to that. So 1,000 years is like one day for God. That's just the other way around of saying it. One day is 1,000 years for God. So the first thing we really want to try and understand is, if you take your age, if let's say we are fortunate, I can't say lucky because then he thinks I refer to him. Let's say you are fortunate to live up to 100 years, and you're fairly strong up to that time. So can you imagine 1,000 years? 100 years is just a tenth of 1,000. So you have to live 100 years 10 times over to get to 1,000 years, and that will be in God's perspective only a day, a 24-hour period. So really, and that's where we get to Peter, where he wants to make this point that we are so limited in our time span, and get so impatient if we have to wait 10 minutes, that if you really can get a grasp on this whole idea of that for God, the last 6,000 years that's gone by in the history of mankind, where we talk about this age and the dark ages and all that, to God, that's like winking twice or blinking twice, right? Something like that. So, it should give us a lot of comfort that God is not forgetting about what he promised, or, we just got to understand where we fit into the broad scheme of things, and then it will make us more patient. Okay, so here's some of the revision, which is important. Peter in 2 Peter 3 verse 8 has this quote where he says, "But beloved, don't be ignorant on this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day." Okay, so we should understand, like we were talking about, the implications of this. But the context of Peter is in verse when he says this in verse 8 to 10, is because there were people that, and we're not going to do much of that today, but we need to understand there were people that said God is slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, right? But he says, no, you must know that God will, one day he will come as a thief in the night, but it's basically all according to a time frame that he's already set, and nothing is going to change that. We just need to understand that it will take longer than we are impatiently waiting for. So if you look at the diagram above, we're going to have that diagram on most of the other slides. So it's nothing rocket science. If we say a day is 1,000 years, then if there's 7 days in a row a week, then that is 7,000 years. And we're going to now see in the Bible how this principle works, that if you make 1,000 years day one, and there is this idea then that as creation was finished after day 6, and we saw God putting the Sabbath there, then that is kind of the time span in not in days, but in a year, years. 7,000 years is the time that will eventually elapse before all is wrapped up and Jesus is back and everything is good and the kingdom is handed over to God. And it is quite amazing, if we do interpret the Bible correct, that we are going to see how close we are to Jesus' return. Now, 35 years ago, 37 years ago, people said, oh, Jesus' return is very close. We're living in the end times. But 37 years went by and Jesus did not return. And my understanding of prophecy is that there has to be a 7-year period that has to be started before Jesus can come back after half of that period. But if it hasn't started, there's still a few years. But at least if we know we're living, say, in day 6, right at the end of day 6, where Jesus must come back, then we kind of have a good idea as to how close things really are, even in our terms now. Because God's week of 6 days is almost done. And although that took 6,000 years for him, it's just a week gone by. Right. So where did Peter get this idea from, that in God's view of things, and him being an eternal being, 1,000 years is like a day? Well, we know he quotes from Psalm 90. Notice verse 3, but verse 2 for context. Before the mountains were brought forth, and ever you have formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So first of all, here's the thing. We battle with this, but God was there from ever in the past, today, and will be there forever in the future. So eternity makes 1,000 years look stupid. It's just like a little pin drop, right? So there's your context. God, before creation, he was there. Before he created the world, he was there for a time that we can't even fathom, or just always and ever. And I don't think anybody's going to get a real grasp on that until we are immortal in the kingdom. But that is the fact. You can like it or not, you can understand it or not, it's not going to change. And after the psalmist now gets us into the context of that, he says in verse 3 immediately, you return man to the dust and say, return, O children of man. So you, God, has been there for eternity, always been there. Then you created the world, and then you say to man, I'm creating you, but you're going to go back to the dust, right? And why did God say this? Why is God eternal? And then when he deals with man, he says, go back to the grave. It's because for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday, when it is past, or the watch of the night. So the psalmist is saying, in something to do with man, and when he returns to dust and dying, and God being eternal has got to do with this idea that for him 1,000 years is just like a day. Now, why did he say that? It's got something to do with Adam, and we know in Psalm 90 verse 3 to 4, when it says you return man to the dust, it comes from Genesis 3 verse 19. This is all from the ESV. By the sweat of your face, Adam, you will eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken. for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. In this idea, to dust you return means you will die. And we know Adam was told, in the day you sin, you will die. But Adam did not die in that day that he sinned. He continued to live another 930 years, times how many days that is. But we know there are two ways that this is true, because he became a dying creature, and dying you will die, and eventually he became old and he died. So he didn't have to die on that very day. But embedded in this is this whole idea that it's still true that in God's eyes, when 1,000 years is but a day, when Adam died at 930, he died in day one of this whole idea of the time frame we have. So I've just put all that down on the right-hand side. Hope you can understand what I'm saying, but this is really what I'm saying. In God's 7,000 years, where day one is 1,000 years, Adam did die on day one. There are two ways in which Adam did die in day one. And remember, for God, those 1,000 years, those 930 years that Adam lived and carried on, for us, that is very, very long. We don't get people to get so old anymore. We only get to be 100 years. But even though Adam died that 930, he is in this prophetic principle, he died in day one. So that's where I believe Peter got this from and understood this principle. And that's why he quotes it in terms of people that wait for what, 100 years maybe, 70 years or 60 years, and then they want to become real smart and smirky and say to God, right? They just don't understand how things work with God. Right, so there's 2 Peter chapter 3. So now we're going to start zooming in further and see how these things really fit into this whole idea of day 1 to day 7 matching up with 1,000 years each, chronologically from Adam all the way through, and how God's plan works. So notice there's 2 Peter 3. If you haven't read it yet, now on the screen, here's your paraphrase. Verse 1, Peter says, here's a reminder for you. 2, think about the prophecies in the Old Testament and our teachings from Jesus, right? That's what he's telling us to. Then he says, notice now, in the last days, there shall be false teachers mocking the idea that Jesus will return. Now, I've made a number 4 next to the name of Jesus, because that's the chronological order of events and people mentioned here. Okay. They say things just continue like the present, like we are now, is the way it's always been. So the present is last in the chronological order, as it has for ages. Notice the word ages, they call it the beginning of creation, Peter says, since creation. So what are these ages, these time periods from the beginning of creation? So creation is the first thing mentioned here, and that is the first thing in the chronology, right? So God created Adam and Eve, and they sinned, and from that time the world just carried on like it has. Nothing ever changes, and it's quite true. Nothing's new under the sun, but that doesn't mean God's moving along with his plan. They prefer, that is the idea of willingly are they ignorant. They prefer to just not take into account that God reset the world in Noah's time with the flood. He cleaned it up. That's what Peter's telling them. And Peter then also refers to, therefore, he will reset it again by sending Jesus to rule as king. So notice the chronology here. We have creation, then the flood through all the ages, then Abram came along, then Jesus came along, and he was born, resurrected, went to heaven, and now Jesus will come back, and then he will rule as king. Maybe we should have turned that around, don't you think? Or no, yeah, Jesus will come back is actually 6, but anyway, we will have to note that. And fix it. So here is all that summarized for you. You've seen this before in the previous class. I just added the column. Day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 down in Peter is 4,000 to 3,000 before Christ. Creation falls into that 1,000-year period, which corresponds to day 1. And so we carry on down to day 7, that is to come, the kingdom of God, when Jesus will rule. Notice that we have Jesus twice in this table, and it's very important, as you can see, as you're going to see. On 0, we know we measure dates in the Western world like that. Jesus was born, when he was born is 0 AD. And then Jesus' rebirth, when he was resurrected and ascended to heaven, happened 33 AD, which is in the day 5,000-year period. And we are now living from 1,000 to 2025, and maybe next year, 2026, who knows? I can't tell you how long that's going to be. And then when is the kingdom going to start? 2030, 2033? People will always want to know, but we can't exactly know. We could maybe put our bets in an envelope, and then when Jesus comes back, we open it and see how far we were right or wrong. So, you know, whenever the kingdom does start, let's say it's in 2030, just an example, I'm not mentioning dates. If it is in 2030, then there's 1,000 years to go from there to the kingdom ending. Right, so here are 6 examples that Peter gives, and in chronological order, they happen in the 6 distinct separate periods of 1,000 years each, which then is interesting when that corresponds to 1,000 years being a day. Right. Did I get it wrong here as well? Yes, we need to make actually it's correct, so we'll just leave it at that. Okay, so now let's look at the patterns. We've done this before, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. We know that we can have a pattern now. There's no time frame on this one, but we don't argue with people on the scientific reasons why Genesis 1 cannot be, and the whole debate about evolution. A lot of people read lots of books to prove that, but it's much more important for us to try and show people that it's a pattern for how we're going to be created. So on day 1, there's light and darkness. Then day 2, the earth covered the waters. We all know day 3, the land came out and there was fruits and bearing seed bearing fruit and trees. On day 4, we have the sun and moon, stars. Day 5, fishes and birds. Day 6, cattle and man was to rule animals and multiply. God rested on the Sabbath day to begin something else. Notice here that it's very nice to understand that on day 1, we hear and we believe the gospel. There's the spiritualness of all of this. You have to first get the light, the gospel. Then day 2, your status with God after baptism changes. You are in the heavenly places. Then you have to have your practical life in Jesus after baptism. You have to be fruitful, abounding in good works, bring forth fruit. So, it's just fascinating how the patterns are all there if we really believe and want to see them. We, on day 4, we're going to reflect Jesus' light. And one day when he gives us life eternal, we will even be like the stars, giving off our own light like he does. But until then, we will have ungodly opposition to God's ways. And the cattle and the fish and the birds are very representative in the Bible of mankind that is ungodly and rebellious, and nations opposing God's rule. And Jesus and the saints will rule at the end of that day in the kingdom. And then there's this 1,000-year kingdom where the saints enter their rest. Jesus hands the kingdom to God. So that is a pattern for us how we must be created spiritually. But it starts giving us idea that, notice, we hear and believe the gospel in our own creation as spiritual beings. We have this kind of allusions back to, oh, that's how it happened right in the beginning. There has to be light first. And it all ends in the kingdom, in the day 7, at the end of day 7. So there's a definite period. And if we can get these patterns to show that they fit in very well when a day is 1,000 years, then we should get excited, because that means we're at the end of 6,000 years. We're at the end of day 6, close to the end of day 6. That's when Jesus comes back and we start the kingdom. So if you have a map in a shop and you're in a mall, it's always interesting to go to that little board that when you don't know where you are and you want to get, that says you are now here. And this is kind of what happens. All right, so what we want to do now, we're going to put the time frame on these days. We've done that before, so we go very quickly. Day 1 is year 0 to 1,000, creation, right? Adam, the sons of God versus the sons of men. Then we have, notice, exact correlation to those events and people on those days. Even correlates exactly to what the creation was about, because in this period we have the flood, and Noah was separated from the world. There's separation, the waters were separated, right? Day 3, now there's land yielded seed bearing fruit, and in that time period of 1,000 years that corresponds to day 3, Abraham is the seed that was promised to receive the land together with the singular seed, Jesus. And Israel in that time was given the word of God to become the custodians of that. And they were planted in the promised land to be the fruitful nation, and which they failed. It's just fascinating when you see this. Right, now here it becomes very interesting, so we got to focus and concentrate. On day 4 corresponds with a greater light, the sun, and we know this corresponds very well at the end of day 4 when Jesus, it becomes day 0, right? When Jesus was born, the Messiah was described, Jesus was described as the light of the world, and Malachi 4 described and prophesied that he would come as the sun. Psalms also say that, right? And then day 5, when there's fishes and birds must multiply, we have Jesus's rebirth when he was resurrected from the tomb. And then the disciples went out and became fishers of men, and the dove, a bird, came and sat on Jesus as the Holy Spirit, and that Spirit was multiplied in all the disciples. Okay, so things really match up well. And then day 6, the cattle and man to rule animals and multiply. If we look at the world now, there's a population of mankind is exponential. And we know that the man who was to rule with his wife Eve over the animals is symbolic of Jesus. And so at the and he was created last, at later in day 6, at the end of day 6, after the cattle. So we're expecting Jesus. There's another way to say Jesus must come in this 1,000-day period, which is in the world we're living now. So really, if we say Jesus' return is soon, then if we said that 37 years ago, having new prophecies and new things happening in the Middle East, we can maybe say we are, most people say he can come tomorrow, or at least we can say 7 to 14 years is a very good sort of thing to look out for. Obviously, we're always going to be ready. If we die tomorrow, we need to be ready. Right, and then when God has ceased to begin something else very important, Sabbath doesn't mean you do nothing, right? You work, change, and you do something different than you did because it's finished. So now there's something new, and right at the end of this class, this is important to remember, because most of the way we interpret prophecy is all about Jesus coming back, and then we sort of close the book. We're in the kingdom, and no one is going to work anymore, right? We are going to work very hard in this last 1,000 years. Right from the beginning, there's lots of work to be done, and we're going to work hard. Let's see later on exactly what that means. And here's your marker. Okay. So we are somewhere around here. That can either scare you or it can make you excited. So I'm not going to ask you what was the first thing that came in your heart when you saw that. It should be excitement, right? Maybe not a bit of apprehension about what must first become worse before Jesus comes to say, okay, enough is enough, and then comes, right. Okay, so that was the revision, guys. What did I do there? Oh, okay. Now I'm going to take most of the board away, and I want you to focus what's left. Okay, here we go. We're taking all that away, and we are now going to go and just focus on day 4 and 5, because I want to show you something fascinating in the Bible. So what I want you to notice now is up top there it says God 7 days 7 is a 7,000 years time frame from creation to now, and it's but a week for God. All of this that has happened, right? So I'm going to take this day 4 and 5 and take that away and make it smaller and very compact and put it up. Just move it up. So here we go. Right. So let's see what we get. And now we're going to see that this is really fundamental in a lot of ways, because you will see that Jesus, when he was born and when he was going to return, but especially when he was born, the day Jesus was born, he made all those Old Testament prophecies come true, but he breaks up this whole 7-day week in 4 days and in 3 days. It's a 4 plus 3 equals 7 split. Okay, am I making sense? The people across the table are nodding because they know they have to, because I'm here, so I don't know what the guys are doing elsewhere. But anyway, so Jesus is born at the end of day 4 and basically starts off day 5, and then he returns at the beginning of day 7, right? So when Jesus returns, it's because day 6 got so bad that Israel has to be saved. He comes back according to Zechariah 14, and the day he lands with his feet on the Mount of Olives again, right? That day, that is the time that we can now say it's day 7, okay? And that's going to be quite soon, because we're way late in day 6 already. Right, so Jesus, there we are. So now, notice what some interesting patterns that come up in the Bible, and I have only listed 2 or 3 for you here. There are many of them. Some of them I'm still trying to understand and try and get them into a simplified matter like this. So if you tell me after the class this was way confusing, I'm not going to be offended, but I hope that at least this makes more sense. Okay. So what are we going to do now? We're going to look at the Bible and see where does 4 plus 3 or 1,000 years, and day 5 and 6 is 2,000 of those years. Where in the Bible do we find things and say, well, they actually fit all of this kind of principles that are in the Bible, this idea of 4 days and then the rest, right? So basically day 1 to 4 is Old Testament times, day 5 onwards is now the times of the Gentiles and so on. Now, in the Bible, there are a feast, 7 feasts mentioned in Leviticus 23, and they are called in Hebrew the Mehudim. So you might hear that sometimes. Okay. Now, we know from our studies that these feasts all have a symbolic counterpart to the whole plan of God. So notice that the first 4 of these feasts that they call the spring feast, I think this is American, it's in a certain time of the year. They are in the Bible, and according to the Jewish year, this is the order. When their New Year starts, which is in September somewhere, they have these 4 feasts, and these first 4 feasts was all fulfilled in the day when Jesus came and he was born, and his 33 years that he lived in that very short blimp of a time in the beginning of day 5, right? And those those four feasts are the Passover, the unleavened bread, the first fruits, and the Pentecost. So Jesus splits those Mehudim also in the 4-3 pattern. We understand the Passover clear, what happened in Exodus. A lamb's blood had to be smeared on the lamppost. And so Jesus, he was in his 33 years at the end, he was also crucified. Then we've done studies on this, what the 7 days of unleavened bread means after the Passover, spiritual for us, the way we're going to live without sin in the future, always coming to God on a Sunday, having been forgiven. The first fruits, giving God our best, and then 50 days later, the Holy Spirit was given to the people, and so on. Okay, and then here's the other part of the other 3 days. The last 3 feasts will only be fulfilled when Jesus comes back and he begins the kingdom area, because those feasts, the trumpets, we know will sound and Jesus will come back. All right, there will be a warning, he's on his way back. And then there's this atonement where he will eventually, especially, make Israel one with God again and change them to be a spiritual nation. And the Feast of Tabernacles is symbolic of what? Table here, who knows? I'm going to ask the table, or anybody can unmute and say. Booths, the table, the Feast of Booths, yes, what do they do?
They made different times so that they celebrated the
Right.
gathering.
Yes, Andrew said they lived in these booths and celebrated living in those booths. Can someone in the class unmute and tell me what that points to in the future? Anybody that does not live in, is not physically present in Kempton Park at the moment.
I'll take a guess and say, like, living safely.
Living safely, yes, and living in the kingdom with God, dwelling with God, yeah. Intense, like something like that. So we can see, thanks to Lanif, we can see that we have these, even the way the feast, appointed times that God has set up fall in this kind of pattern where there's these first 4 representing that first 4 days, and then the last 3 will be fulfilled after a period of time, and then specifically in day 7. So again, there's this definite time period that is set by God that we can know we are moving towards. It's not that God has forgotten about things or changes his mind every second week. Okay, I'll delay a little more and a little more and a little more. No, there's a day set. It's all a clockwork according to God's time frame and his clock. Okay, then notice this. Perhaps, I'm not saying I want to go and look at this, but perhaps it's a kind of a formula for us to go and look at the book of Revelation, because in Revelation 6, we got 4 horsemen and seals, and we do know that they got to respond quite well to when Jesus prophesied and said, when you see these things come to pass, it's only the beginning of sorrows, wars and famine. So it's, it's going to be there's going to be still a lot of things going on before I return, right? And then Revelation 6 then talks about 3 latter seals that is later on in chronology. So maybe we should try and go with this formula, look at that and see if we can't get the timing a bit better understanding of that. Same in Revelation 8, there's the first 4 trumpets. And then, and again in Revelation 8, then there's 3 woe trumpets. Okay, I'm just saying Revelation is a difficult book, but there's something we can think of. Right. So here's something fascinating I want to show you. Notice Hosea. We're going to go to Hosea 6 verse 11, and look at what he says, and see if this principle might not be telling us something more than we look at them, and it makes us a bit confused when we read Hosea. Here it is on the screen. Um, so you can either read in your own Bible or on the screen, doesn't matter. But Hosea 6 says, so there's an all new stuff. Even Liana's leaning a bit forward. Nice to have people around the table. Okay. Hosea said, come and let us return to Yahweh, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. Now, if you just read Hosea and you have no understanding of prophecy and never done anything, you will say, okay, Hosea's in a time, he was, by the way, in day 4. That's in around about 780 before Jesus, right? So on the 4th day, in that 1,000-year period of God's great plan, he was prophesying near the end of Israel's time, and when Jesus was pretty much near on the horizon compared to people living in day 1, right? So you would say, oh, Hosea, and true, in those days of his life, Israel was under siege, and Israel was always having problems because they're disobedient to God. They're not a spiritual nation. And you will say, right, he wants to be saved by God. He wants Israel to be saved and bind them up again because they were stricken. But then he says, after 2 days, he will revive us. And on the 3rd day, he will raise us up that we may live in his sight. Now, that doesn't make much sense. We might want to make it little days. But anyway, just that phrase should pick up your ears, because the whole idea of Jesus being raised on the 3rd day, after 3 days, we're talking inclusive of days, you'll see something similar is happening here. So then he says, let us know, let us pursue the knowledge of Yahweh. His going forth is established as the morning. He will come to us like the rain, like the latter and former rain to the earth. Now, I'll be honest with you, 5 years ago, I would read these verses and actually they would just go right over my head, and I would say, he's just being idealistic and he wants Israel to know about God. But this prophecy is far, far more in the future with this principle. Let me try and show you. First of all, Israel was never revived in Hosea's time. And if they were, after what 2 days? This is ever mentioned in the Bible. It was June the 2nd, way back when, 789, and then, there was 2 days, and on the 3rd day, they were never. Okay, the days never came where they were saved by Jesus or the Messiah and ruled in righteousness, living in eternity, because that's what it means there. You should know from what we've said in other classes and studies that's been done in our ecclesia that verse 3 tells you that verse speaks of kingdom time, when everyone will go up to the mountain of the Lord and live by the law of Jesus, and the law, the Torah, is shown in Psalm 72 to reign. Jesus will take that law and he will have it rain on the people, right? And they will grow with like green grass and they'll become righteous, right? So, when it says after 2 days he will revive us, on the 3rd day he will raise us up that we may live in his sight, it's saying, I'm looking at a further time in the future when the Messiah will come, when Jesus will come, and he will reign in Jerusalem. It's a prophecy of Jesus. And God, who has stricken us, will bind us up again, right? Let us go to God, right? He will bind us up. There will be, when Jesus comes back, there will be a regathering of the Jews, because they would have been scattered again before he comes back. And the majority of the Jews will only come back after Jesus saves them. And this is what's going to happen, right? So, and to live then in Jesus' sight as he rules from Jerusalem. Now notice, if we take day 5, day 6, and day 7, day 1, 2, and 3, what's going to happen here? Mom, can you see the screen? Okay. On the third day is day 7, 2 days after Jesus, when Jesus comes back, and a day is 1,000 years, there'll be 2,000 years that go by, and on the third day, when Jesus comes back, day 7, he will raise the saints, will raise them, and then he will go and regather those people, raise the land, make it a safe land where everyone can dwell, and he will rule from Jerusalem. So what I'm trying to say is Isaiah ideal that he wanted is in terms of a day is 1,000 years, and prophetic of Jesus shows us that, he and the people of his time that were faithful might have not known, but they were going to die somewhere during day 4, and a lot of years are going to go by, and another 2,000 years have now gone by, has to go by, and then only will his prophecy be fulfilled. But for God, again, it's like he said 1 hour ago or 2 minutes ago, he said, this is going to happen, and then it happened. Does this make sense? Don't you think it's fascinating? I love this gem. I didn't find this. I'm borrowing from other people, but there's no copyright, and we all share in collective knowledge in the brotherhood. Our day of rest is the beginning, and that's what I really want to leave with you. I think we are just about done, which will be very helpful in when we explain and study prophecy, is this principle of, if you look at that arrow, the prophecies are hyper focused on the beginning of day 7 when Jesus comes back and he has subdued all the nations, and Ezekiel 38, Gog and Magog is dealt with, and everybody, and he just starts to reign, and now it's all lovely. That is not really what's going on. When Jesus comes back, he first comes to Jerusalem, he subdues the nations round about, and we as the saints are with him. And that's only the beginning of this work, where the stone that hits the feet grows gradually bigger until it is a mountain that fills the whole earth, which will take another 1,000 years. But in that day 7,000 years, we will at least be immortal, doing things so right that when we speak, it's almost as if it's done, even if it's going to be done in 100 years from now. But things will happen rapidly, effectively, and your word is as good as done, even if it happens in a week, a month, or 10 years or 100 years. So our day of rest, day 7, with the kingdom, notice, is the beginning of kingdom work with Jesus. Here is some of the work that has to be done. The Jews, the real Jews that scatter all over the world, will have to be regathered to the land. We're going to help with that. We're going to see that Israel is made a spiritual nation again. In Ezekiel 37, that last phase of the bones coming together, and then there's the Spirit of God is in them and they obey, happens after Jesus returns. He doesn't get them to be a holy nation and therefore he returns. He returns to save them from extinction. And because he has saved them, they are now of a much more receptive heart to have that rain that will fall, right? The law will rain down. When will it start raining down? Only when he comes back to Jerusalem, not before, right? Someone like Elijah will go before, like the Bible says, to get their hearts more prepared, right? But that will make the ground ready. So when he comes, then the rain will fall, and they will start turning to be this godly nation, right? It happens after Jesus returns in the beginning years of day 7. And then lastly, Jesus will subdue the nations gradually, right? So first the nations round about, then Ezekiel 38, and the opposing nations. Even at the end of day 7, there's the last uprising from Gog, and again, gathering nations. Can you believe it? After 1,000 years, men's memories are very short, right? Maybe men's memories are as short as days are for God, because we quickly forget and then we get wicked again and evil. And it after World War I, it took 30 years, and then it was World War II. And after World War I, they said that was the war that would end all wars forever for mankind. It took 30 years and they were at it again. And now we have wars. Right. So I hope that you can see that with this idea of a day being 1,000 years for God, there is these patterns and things that are said that makes the Bible much more alive. Because to me, Isaiah 6, for example, now I look at those verses and things just jump out at me to show this is what he's referring to. It was something he might have wished for in his days, but it was only going to happen thousands of years later. But it's all to God's glory and his will that will be done in the end. Finally, all things completed. So I'm going to leave it at that. We will another time maybe look at the whole idea of Jubilee being 50 years and how that all fits into this pattern, but not for tonight. I must first figure out how to put that on a screen that will make it maybe interesting and convincing. So that's where we end the class tonight. Any input, comments will be more than welcome.